Hi, and welcome to this on-demand webinar for website accessibility. We will share the important things you need to know when developing a website to help keep your websites not only ADA compliant, but accessible to everyone in your community. Now, if you're already a School Webmasters client, don't worry. We take care of all of this for you and ensure your website meets current standards and recommendations when we develop it. But if you're not a School Webmasters client, these are things you'll want to keep in mind when developing your own site. This webinar will cover mostly website accessibility, but at the end, Kelly will mention document accessibility, which is also important. Everyone submitting content for your website, including documents, photos, videos, etc., must complete web accessibility training to ensure your website remains both accessible and compliant. Our team at School Webmasters can help you make accessible documents, or we have a paid online course if you're interested in doing it yourself. Now, let's turn the time over to Kelly.
Hi, this is Kelly, and I am the Director of Website Accessibility here at School Webmasters. In this video, I will provide you with the accessibility training you need to get started developing accessible websites. So what will we cover in this training? First, we'll talk about the importance of web accessibility. Then we'll talk about why school websites have to be accessible. Next, we'll go over the benefits of an accessible website, because there are more benefits to it than just following the law. Then we'll cover some of the common website accessibility barriers that we find and what we can do about them. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about document accessibility. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So why should I have an accessible website? So whenever I present on accessibility, I like to start with the why. Understanding why we have to be accessible creates the empathy that we're going to need when it comes to actually applying accessibility. So why should I have an accessible website? When I hear someone ask this, I always think of the first line of that famous sonnet, "How do I love thee?" Because my first instinct is always to say, "Let me count the ways." Having an accessible website isn't just about being in compliance with the Americans with Disability Act, commonly known as ADA, Section 508, Section 504, or any other accessibility standard or guideline. There are many reasons other than the law as to why you should be accessible, and those are the main reasons that we're going to focus on. So true or false, accessible web design benefits a small percentage of the U.S. population. The percentage of people in the U.S. with disabilities is calculated at about 13.2%. That's from the Institute of Disability at the University of New Hampshire. The U.S. Census Bureau has this number at about 12.7%. I imagine they may each have their own theories on how they account for it, but either way, we're talking about almost 50 million people. So I'd say that's not a small number of people. Accessibility really affects most of us. So to begin with, why should you have an accessible website? The first way I want to mention is that it's simply the right thing to do. So if you see the picture that we have here, it sort of sums up why we need to have an accessible website. For example, with this slide, the picture shows a young man in a wheelchair at the foot of some stairs. He has his hands up as if to say, "Why would you have stairs without a wheelchair ramp?" Or, "How am I supposed to get in the building?" So imagine if this was your school. How would your students, staff, parents, or anyone coming to your school be able to access the building without a ramp if they were in a wheelchair? You probably would never think of having steps without providing a way for someone in a wheelchair to be able to get to the top. So you should think the same way when it comes to a website. Just like a ramp is what the man in the picture would need to access a building in order to receive the same information or services as someone who's not in a wheelchair, accessibility techniques on the website is what someone who is visually or hearing impaired would need to access everything on that website. Now, I mentioned vision and hearing, but something I want to be sure to point out is that Website accessibility is for more than just people who are completely blind or completely deaf. So let's talk about some of the different disabilities that are affected by website accessibility. First, cognitive disabilities. So you see in this picture, the young boy is looking at his tablet in confusion. How often does this happen to us when we're trying to get to something that should be easy to find and only end up being frustrated because it's not where it should be, or there isn't a good structure of the website? For someone with a cognitive disability, it could be really difficult to keep them focused and engaged if the website doesn't have a clear layout and a clear design. The good thing about this is when School Webmasters develops websites, we already have a clear layout and design. And so that carries over to accessibility. Those accessibility standards that have to be met with that, we're already meeting. But it's definitely something that you need to be aware of so that as you add content to a website, as you add different pages, that you make sure you keep that layout clear and understandable. The next thing is a temporary disability. So you see the young girl with a broken arm. Now, if she is left-handed, that's going to be pretty hard to navigate a website, especially if she's used to using a mouse with that hand. If you've ever tried to use a mouse with the opposite hand, or really do anything with your hand that's not the dominant hand that you use, it can be pretty difficult and quite frustrating. So if a website is keyboard accessible, you'll be able to use just the keyboard to get to everything. And you could also use something like voice recognition to access things. Like a screen reader, voice recognition is something that requires a website to be designed accessibly in order to work properly. So ensuring that a website has a good keyboard accessibility feature is a big part of website accessibility. You could have someone who isn't completely blind, but maybe is colorblind. So I have a cousin who has protanopia, which means he can't really see reds. And I asked him one day how it was for him in school. What did he do when he needed to distinguish something by color? He said, well, I just guessed because I didn't want to ask for help with something that should have really been simple and have someone make fun of me. So I thought, how sad. We'll talk a lot about color contrast and some of the ways that we can provide sufficient color contrast and how to avoid using only color to distinguish elements. Now, the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, is the creator of Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG or WCAG. You'll hear it said in various ways, and they have some really good perspective videos. We'll use some of these videos and also provide a link where you can see a compilation of all the videos. I encourage you to watch each one and just pay close attention to some of the ways that web accessibility can affect a wide variety of people. Now, I just mentioned a few examples, but as you can see, web accessibility really covers a wide range of disabilities. So another reason for having an accessible website would be user experience. So accessible design provides a better user experience for everyone. For example, with a heading structure, you want to be sure to use a heading structure defined in the HTML of your pages and not just make something bold or a different color to distinguish it as a heading. Another example of accessibility providing a good user experience would be keyboard navigation. Now I'm a sighted user who uses a mouse, but when I complete a form online, I prefer to tab to each form field instead of stopping to use my mouse. If a website is keyboard accessible, I can do this. And speaking of forms, something new in WCAG 2.1 is to implement autocomplete on forms. You've probably noticed a lot of forms you're filling out now can automatically input your basic information like your name, phone number, email address, and think it's a great new feature of your browser. But it's actually an accessibility technique that's implemented on the form structure itself by the developer. So as time goes on, I'm seeing more and more accessibility on websites that help everyone regardless of their abilities. We're going to go into more detail on these in just a bit, but these are just some of the basic things to start thinking about. So another example of why you should have an accessible website is that it increases SEO, or search engine optimization. So for example, in addition to a page with a good heading structure being something assistive technology like a screen reader can use to navigate a page. It's also something search engines can use to find search results. Accessibility requirements such as title tags, alternative text, and captions are all examples of elements that enhance both SEO and accessibility. And these are all things that search engines use to index pages and place your website in more search results. And then, of course, the last thing I'm going to mention is the law. There are federal and state laws in place that require accessibility. And it would be great if everyone would focus on the purpose of accessibility and just do it because it's the right thing to do. Unfortunately, it's not the case, and we have a lack of regulation from the Department of Justice, which leads to confusion. And so we see a lot of litigation going on with web accessibility. Now, I'll mention a few things today that pertain to laws. However, I do want to provide a disclaimer that I'm not an attorney and School Webmasters is not a law firm. So if you ever find yourself needing legal advice about website accessibility, we do encourage you to contact an attorney. So with that, what exactly are the legal requirements for web accessibility? There are a lot of accessibility laws in place, so let me forewarn you, I will mention a lot of acronyms, but I'll be sure to explain each one. So first, there is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which provides discrimination on the basis of disability in programs such as those conducted by federal agencies and programs receiving federal financial assistance, such as the National School Lunch Programs. And then similar to the Rehabilitation Act, we have the Americans with Disability Act, or ADA. Both of these laws are very similar, but they do have differences in their procedures and how they are enforced. The ADA is regulated by the Department of Justice, and I mention that because one thing we heard a lot about recently in 2018 was that the Department of Justice decided to update their case processing manual. And they did this to allow them to dismiss copycat cases. So that was if someone wanted to just, go to a website, file a complaint because something was not accessible, and then copy that same complaint on another website. Senators fought this update, and the Department of Justice had to resend the changes, and all of the previously closed complaints were reopened. So again, you want to be sure that you never encourage anyone to just fly under the radar and wait for strict regulations. Website accessibility is something you can do and should do now if it's not already being applied. Finally, we also have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which governs how accessibility is provided. So how are all of these laws enforced? That depends on what type of entity you are. The U.S. Department of Justice enforces ADA regulations governing state and local government services, which is covered in Title II, and public accommodations, which is covered in Title III of the ADA. And then, of course, if you are an educational institute, the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, or OCR, enforces the accessibility laws for you. So if someone's going to file a complaint, this is where they're going to file it. So you can see that when it comes to accessibility, there isn't really a question of if we have to comply. There are a lot of laws that show that we do. So with that, does everyone comply? Unfortunately, no. And of course, this is why we're seeing so many lawsuits for website accessibility. So what can we do? First, let me say this. I do not recommend looking at another website and saying, well, they added this, so it must be okay. Know what regulations and guidelines need to be followed to ensure web content is accessible and remains in compliance with accessibility laws. This is where the lack of regulation makes it a little confusing. How do we know how to apply accessibility? W3C comes to our rescue again for this one. They developed the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that I mentioned previously. Again, you'll hear it WCAG, WCAG, WCAG. I will typically say WCAG. It all means the same thing, and we're all talking about the same standards. There's no real definitive way to say it. I do have a link here that you can go and look at the guidelines. So a little bit about WCAG. The Worldwide Web Consortium, or W3C, developed the international standards for the web, such as HTML and CSS. WCAG was developed by W3C's Web Accessibility Initiative, or WAI. WCAG 2.0 is the current standard that we see enforced a lot. However, WCAG 2.1 was released in June of 2018, and I'd recommend using the most up-to-date guidelines so you don't have to go back and add things later when 2.1 is in force. As a side note to that, Section 508 has already required WCAG 2.1 because it requires the latest standards. WCAG is governed by 4 principles that say your website should be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So let's elaborate a little on what each of those mean. So to begin, perceivable. What makes a website perceivable? So the user must be able to perceive the information presented. It must be visible to some of their senses. So whenever you add content to a website, always ask, is this content perceivable? So we're talking about not just perceivable to a sighted person or a person who can hear or a person that doesn't have any other disability that would affect the way they use the website. We need to make sure that it can be presented in a way that can reach more than one sense. So for audio disabilities, we would include captions or transcripts for videos. For visual disabilities, we would include alternative text on images, text that has the ability to zoom or enlarge, and sufficient color contrast. Operable. The user must be able to operate the interface. So an example of a website that is operable would be a website that has keyboard accessibility, video content that can be paused or stopped, and skip links. All those things would make a website operable. Understandable. The user must be able to understand the operation of the user interface. So this would cover things that help with cognitive disabilities. For example, using a consistent navigation across all pages. When a component has a functionality, it has the same functionality on all of the website pages. So what I mean by that is if you have something like a button for a user to search the website, you wouldn't want to have the button labeled search on one page and then find on another page. Instead, the buttons need to be labeled the same on all of the web pages of the site. And finally, robust. The user must be able to access and interpret the content in a variety of ways, including assistive technologies. A robust website will use HTML correctly. Form elements will have labels. If you get an error while filling out a form, you may see some text on the page that says you did it wrong. This information needs to be accessible to assistive technologies like screen readers also. So in WCAG, these 4 principles each have testable success criteria that are split into 3 levels. So each level adds a little more requirements. It's level AA that we pretty much always see required. So this is the one that we're going to recommend following. So now we know we have to provide an accessible website. We know why and what guidelines we have to use to help us do this. So let's talk about how someone with a disability may use the web. One way is they may use assistive technology. This would be any device that helps people work around their challenges so they can learn, communicate, and function better. So when we're talking about web development, a lot of times we'll say screen readers or voice recognition, but assistive technology can be a wide variety of things. These are all examples of assistive technology: a pencil grip, a knee scooter, a hearing aid, glasses or contact lenses. So when it comes to a website, we will use things like a screen reader or screen magnifiers, voice recognition, head pointers. These are all things that our interfaces need to be able to work with in order to provide all of the content, just as someone who was sighted or didn't have any other impairments. So let's talk some more about some different disabilities, auditory disabilities. This would pertain to a website being perceivable. Someone could have anything from a mild to a severe hearing loss. The big one for this would be our video content. We want to make sure that captions are available. So all video content, recorded and live, must have captions. It is one of the easier things to do for accessibility, and YouTube is a great free resource to be able to do that. One thing to remember is if you're ever the one to add captions, you always want to make sure that even if you're using, say, YouTube that auto-generates those captions, that you go back and edit them. Chances are that they're going to have some words that may not have translated correctly. So you want to make sure that everything on there is appropriate and is actually read as what is being said. And I know I talk a lot about how accessibility features help everyone. Even if you don't have a hearing disability, having captions on your videos can be super helpful. If you have a loud room with kids, maybe you need to turn those captions on so you can hear things. If you're in a quiet room and maybe you're in a library, when you don't have headphones and you want to play a video, having captions there will allow you to watch that video. Visual disabilities. Again, this could be anything from complete blindness to low vision, color blindness. It's really a wide range of disabilities when it comes to visual disabilities. Having a website that supports people with visual disabilities would include things like alt text and the general layout of the website. We had a call from a potential client that said they couldn't use red or green on their website because of ADA. That's not true. That's where having some knowledge of those WCAG standards really is helpful. You can use red and green. They just have to have enough contrast in order for everyone to be able to perceive them. Now here's one of the perspective videos that W3C provides.
Web Accessibility Perspectives. Colors with good contrast. There's something about great design that allows it to go practically unnoticed. But it doesn't take much to make things confusing and frustrating. Choosing colors with poor contrast makes navigating, reading, and interacting a real pain. Good design means sufficient contrast between foreground and background colors. That's not just text and images, but links, icons, and buttons. If it's important enough to be seen, then it needs to be clear. And this is essential for people with low contrast sensitivity, which becomes more common as we age. With good colors, websites and applications can be easier to use in more situations, like in different lighting conditions. Web accessibility, essential for some, useful for all.
Another example that will help put color contrast into perspective would be if you think about a standard traffic light. Is the green on the top or on the bottom? So you probably guessed it right. The green is on the bottom. What if the light is horizontal? It's on the right. All lights are not standard, so we need to be sure that there's enough contrast on things like this so when it's not in the place that we're expecting it to be, it can still be perceived. Now take a look at these lights. What do you see different about them? You'll notice that a lot of these lights have arrows or figures of people to help show you what is being presented. It's more than just a red light or green light or where the location is. It's giving a little more information. That's really good for accessibility. So another example of something to test for with color contrast would be if you have something like a button. It looks good and it has sufficient color contrast, but when you hover over the button, the background of the button color goes away, so we no longer can see that search word. Color contrast needs to be sufficient in all states. So whether it's hovering over something using a mouse or it's the focus, meaning that you're using a keyboard and you're tabbing through, and as you land on that button, you need to see where you are. So that keyboard focus needs to also have sufficient color contrast ratios. Now there's another thing that I'd like to point out that you have to consider with color contrast. In addition to testing color contrast, we also need to be careful with how we use color, and that we need to be sure we don't use color as the only visual means to convey information. So we can see the results here show the contrast ratios pass or fail by using a green or a red circle. This is only using color to convey information. Instead, we could use a check mark to show that the contrast ratio was sufficient for the first button, but then it failed on hover and focus, so we're going to use an X to show that it failed in that area. Now, we can still have it red and green, but changing the shape on it would make it accessible to everyone. So I briefly mentioned link contrast. You need to make sure if you have a link in a paragraph that it passes the ratios as well. So if you can see here that the red and the black do not have enough contrast, so that would be a failure. Now that black text against the background does pass, but we need to make sure that there is enough contrast with the red and the black, not just the background. For this example, the link actually does not even have enough contrast against the background. So that would be something that we would need to adjust. If someone didn't have any color vision, this is what it would look like. So you can see that it's hard to really distinguish where that link is. So just to recap, with color contrast, test the colors of all your text against the background colors. You want to test the text in your images as well. We never recommend graphics with text inside of them, but if for some reason it needs to be there, we need to make sure that the text in the graphic passes against the background of the graphic. And of course, like I said, test on hover and focus states as well. Don't use color as the only means of conveying information, and test link to non-link text contrast. Text zoom. Here we have another perspective video from W3C.
Web accessibility perspectives. Customizable text. What's right for you doesn't necessarily work for the next person. Customization isn't always just a question of preference, though. Sometimes it's a necessity. Being able to adjust the text is crucial for people with low vision and dyslexia. Properly coded websites and applications allow the text to be customized. For example, to change its size, spacing, font, and colors without loss of functions or clarity. Web accessibility, essential for some, useful for all.
So there's a bit more to consider with alternative text. Let's say that we have something like this pie chart. We need to be sure to include all of the text as well as describe everything in the image. For something like this, my first recommendation would be to include all of the same information from the graphic directly on the page as real text. So in this example, you can see how everything in the image is also included in the text, and then the alt attribute can be null, which means it can be empty. It still needs that alt attribute, but we don't have to put any content in it. Another thing to consider with alternative text is that if the image is linked to something, the alt text should be the purpose of the link. So let's say we did not include the details of the chart on the page, but we linked the image to an accessible document that included the details, then the alt text could be something like this: student success rates for quarters 1 through 4. Now, when someone using a screen reader lands on this link, that's what will be read to them. So they know if they follow the link, what they are going to. I always recommend, if it can be done in HTML, meaning, putting the text directly on the page in some way, that's always the better option. Documents can be made accessible, but it does require that extra step of having to open the document in Adobe Reader and reading it that way. When at all possible, go ahead and just add the content directly to the page. The thing about alternative text is that it's the easiest thing to implement, yet it can be one of the hardest things to do right. So just always remember it can't be automated. Social media sites try to automate alt text. The alt text for this image on a social media site is image may contain 2 people, people standing, sky, and outdoor. The description really doesn't tell me anything about the image. Again, just do your best to describe to someone as if you were talking to them on the phone, and it should be fine. Let's move on to clear layout and design.
Web accessibility perspectives. Clear layout and design. Poor layout can be very frustrating.
A man in a kitchen is looking for things to make a coffee.
And the same applies to the web. Good design involves good layout, and that means a better user experience.
The man is frustrated about not finding what he is looking for. The man rearranges the kitchen in a time lapse.
This includes clear headings, navigation bars, and consistent styling.
The man is now browsing a badly laid out pizza delivery website and is shaking his head.
Any web user will get frustrated with bad layout and design.
A woman is using the same complex website with screen magnification. She only sees a portion of the screen at a time, so the website appears even more confusing.
Complex layouts also make finding information difficult or impossible for people with visual disabilities.
The woman is shaking her head and is unable to use that website.
And they are confusing for people with cognitive and learning disabilities who need clarity and consistency of the presentation.
The man calls a friend over to help. The friend is just as confused and navigates to a different, better piece of website.
Bad design also impacts anyone who isn't particularly confident around computers.
This second website is much clearer and easier to use. They are both happy. The woman using screen magnification has also used that website and is delightfully eating a pizza.
A lot of things that we do is incorporated in having a good, clean, and clear layout and design. So when we add content to a website, we need to be sure that we use correct formatting. So for example, would you rather read text like this that doesn't have any formatting, or something like this that has a good heading and list structure? I'm not going to read everything on the slide, but I just want to show how something as simple as having a good layout with a good heading structure not only helps search engines and assistive technology navigate a page, but it gives a better user experience for everyone who views the page. So when you're looking for something in particular on a lengthy page, what do? I know as a sighted user, I will look at the headings, look at the links, look at the things that really stand out to me. I'm not going to just read the entire page. A sighted user can clearly see that there's a title of the page, and it is school websites must meet ADA standards. It can see that there is another section with a title, how we maintain ADA compliant school websites. And then there's also a list structure. That list structure isn't just developed by pressing 1 period space space, 2 period space space. We actually use the tools that are available to us to add a list structure, and that puts the proper HTML on the back end. So it's identified as a list to Assistive Technology. Now with headings, things to remember is only use one H1 per page. That's the main heading of the page. And don't skip headings. If you go from heading level 1 to heading level 2, heading level 3, we don't skip headings just to make it visually appealing. And then of course it's always okay to skip backwards if you have a heading level 2 or 3 and then you need to go, from heading level 4 back to heading level 2. It is okay to skip backwards. It is important to remember never to leave an empty heading. As a user navigates a page with a screen reader and they go from heading to heading, and they get to a heading and there's no content there, that could be confusing. Now for site navigation orientation, that's where what comes in is the consistent navigation. So we don't want to change that navigation menu on different pages. Keep it the same across all pages. Orphan pages or blind pages are the pages that they aren't necessarily in that navigation menu, but we get to it from another page. So if we have a link to it from another page and it brings up the orphan or the blind page, we'll call it, we have to have another way to get to that. Everything has to have multiple ways. We implement the search feature on all our websites, and that is sufficient to provide another way. If we didn't have that, another technique would be to provide a sitemap that a user can look at and be able to see all those hidden pages. Link purpose, that has a lot to do with when content updaters add links to a website, they want to avoid non-distinguishable links. So a couple examples of that would be, first, if you have something like a read more button or click here, which we'll see that on websites. We don't use click here. It's not recommended. Not everyone clicks. Some people tap, some people talk. So we don't want to ever use click here. But if we see something like that or read more, we need to be sure that the backend is set up correctly with a good structure, has something such as an ARIA label on it, that it actually isn't read as read more. An example would be our news articles. We'll see there is a read more link, but the backend is actually structured so it would say read more about and name the title of that news article. If we don't do this, then when a screen reader user navigates through the site with their screen readers and they just go from link to link, they would hear read more link, read more link, read more link. That would be quite confusing. They would not know what they're reading more about. So an example of another thing we might see, let's say we have an arrow here and this is a button and it says continue. And the alt text on this is next. We added some alt text to that image so that it's distinguishable to everyone, but this would not be correct because next is not what the button says. So if we add something that's linked like that, we need to put in the alt text the text that's in the image. And on the bottom example, you can see, and this is the back end of how it looks, the alt text is actually continue. That will be the correct way to implement it.
Web accessibility perspectives, notifications and feedback. All the right gears can be put in motion. The hands can be at the exact place they need to be. But if you don't get the response that you're expecting, you'll end up wondering if there's some sort of problem. It's the same on the web. Without clear notifications and feedback, people are quickly disoriented and confused. Especially error messages, which are often complex and confusing. Yet making them understandable is usually quite simple. Making websites and apps predictable and understandable makes them accessible to people with cognitive and learning disabilities. And more usable for everyone, especially for people with lower computer skills. Web accessibility, essential for some, useful for all.
The thing we need to know about form validation is that we need to identify and describe errors to everyone. So when there's an error with submitting a form and there's an error presented to a sighted user, we need to make sure that it's also presented to a screen reader user. Another good suggestion to do for form validation is to be sure to suggest how to fix it. So rather than just saying there's an error for a form, we would want it to say, for example, like this one says, please enter your email address, so they know where the error is. So moving on to tables. The biggest thing to remember about tables is only use them for tabular data. So if something doesn't actually have a heading with data in each column or row, it's not actually a table and we don't need to design it as a table. A good true table will have headings that describes what's in each cell that's associated with it. We can see here we have two headings, action and timeline, and each of the data cells below those headings are associated with them.
Web accessibility perspectives, keyboard compatibility. Not being able to use your computer because your mouse doesn't work is frustrating. Many people use only the keyboard to navigate websites, either through preference or circumstance. Whether it's temporarily limited mobility, a permanent physical disability, or simply a broken mouse, the result is the same. Websites and apps need to be operable by keyboard. Web accessibility, essential for some, useful for all.
Okay, so keyboard accessibility. This is a big one. Luckily, it's easy to test. So you can go to any website, you can go to your website, and then begin by clicking on the browser tab at the top. You want to use the tab key to tab through everything that you see on the page. You want to look to see if there is a skip to content link present. And you want to notice if you skip anything. And then whatever you can, you want to fix with CSS. A lot of times you can fix keyboard accessibility with CSS because a lot of times it's simply the fact that there is no focus effect written into the styles. And then sometimes you will have to edit the HTML or the JavaScript as needed just to finish up fixing those keyboard accessibility issues. And so I'll show you just real quick how I can check the keyboard accessibility on our Biz Webmasters website. I'm going to click at the top on the browser tab and I'll just start tabbing through. You can see the first thing I come to is the skip to main content link. You'll want to make sure that the colors here pass color contrast as well. And you'll want to test that and make sure that it actually brings your focus down to the main content area. You'll want to skip the navigation with that skip to main content link because that's something that's repeated on every page. So I'll just continue tabbing. You can see that I have a dashed outline around the links in the header. And then I go down to the navigation menu and you can see there is a visual change so we can see where our focus is. Those are the types of things that you're looking for. If you start tabbing and you don't see a change, so you don't know where your focus is going, that's when you want to start investigating the issue and see if you need to edit the CSS, HTML, some other type of script that may be causing you to lose focus. One common thing we'll see when the outline effect is not there is that someone may have their CSS written so that the focus effect has an outline of 0. A lot of times what they're trying to do is to get rid of that default outline that browsers will use and use their own effect. But if they leave out their own personalized effect, then we lose keyboard focus altogether. So we want to make sure that we do have some type of focus in our CSS. You can see here the focus effect. I have an outline of 1 pixel dash 000, which is black. A lot of times it's very beneficial to use a dashed outline, whether it's black or white, depending on your site colors. That way it helps to distinguish that outline from whatever background is behind it. One thing I typically do is anytime I have a hover effect in my CSS, I match it with the focus effect, and that way it will stay the same for all users. And this is just another example of how you can apply a state change. In this example here, I have a screenshot of some links that I was tabbing through, and notice how you can see that I'm focused on the second link. Not only did the text change colors, but the underline also went away, so I knew where my focus is. We don't want to rely just on color for that change. And then in this next example, you'll see the state change. You see that blue outline. You can barely see it actually, and there's probably some color contrast issues there. That's the default outline that you'll typically see in Chrome when you tab through a website. For this particular one, there is a border above and a border below, and that's how we knew that we were focused on that one. The natural state, of course, was just like the Join Us without any borders on top or bottom. In this last example, you can see how the middle icon shrinks a little bit. So there was some type of change there as we focused through the different elements. And again, like I said, a lot of times the focus can be solved with CSS, but sometimes it will involve a little more programming. So you'll want to work with your programmer if needed to resolve any of those keyboard issues. So when you're testing for keyboard accessibility and there is not a visible focus that you can see, I want to show you a little tip that you can use to figure out where you are. So if you look in this screenshot, I was focused on the podcast icon. This one does have the focus effect of the dashed outline, but if it didn't, I could look at the bottom left of the screen, and because the page has a good title of Podcast Library, I could figure out that my focus is on the podcast icon. So another way to figure it out is simply to activate the link by pressing enter and see where it takes you. Once you figure out where it's going, then you can go back to the previous page and that'll help you figure out what you were focused on, and then you can go adjust your styles as needed. So you can imagine if there were multiple elements without keyboard focus that it could get pretty tedious to figure out where the focus is bringing you. For flashing and strobing content, I actually recommend not using it at all. But let's say you have a client and they insist that something needs to blink a bit. You want to be sure that it doesn't blink more than 3 times in any 1 second. For this example here, you can see how, in my opinion, it could be very annoying. Let's just not do it. Again, if it's something that they insist on, no more than 3 times per second. Now you want to make sure that each one of your pages has a language element declared. This is declared in the HTML tag of your page. So if, for example, the page is written in English, your HTML language attribute would be set to English, which is EN. And you would just change that depending on the language of your page. In addition to declaring the page language, you also want to declare the language of different parts of the page if the language changes. So you could see the example I have here for language of parts. This particular text on the page was written in Spanish, and so in the P tag for that element, we added its own language tag for Spanish, which is ES. Carousels. So everyone wants a carousel. The best advice I can give you about carousels is to leave the carousels at the amusement parks where they belong. Carousels can be an accessibility nightmare, and I'm going to give you some reasons why. First, the start and stop functionality. If the carousel is automatically scrolling, there needs to be a way to start and stop it, and you need to be able to do that without using your mouse. So something like just hovering over it to make it stop would not be sufficient. Carousels need to be keyboard accessible. Let's say the carousel is not automatically scrolling and you have buttons to manually scroll through each slide. These buttons need to be accessible with only the keyboard and with a screen reader. Something I often see is that I can get to the buttons with the keyboard, but when using a screen reader, I activate the button to go to the next slide and nothing happens. The photo changed, but if I'm not a sighted user, I don't actually know that that happened. Color contrast is another big issue with carousels. You have little white carrots or arrows to show you where to click to get to the next slide, and the background of that slide is white, so now you can't see the buttons anymore. Text zoom is another one. If you decide to add slides with text in them, a lot of times the text is actually added as an image, which is always bad for accessibility. Text only needs to be able to increase in size up to 200%. Not only do graphics not increase in size when you zoom text only, but sometimes a user will disable their graphics, and then the beautiful slide doesn't even display for them at all. Another reason that we do not recommend carousels is that a small percentage of users actually click on the slides or wait for each one to see what they are. There was a study done on Notre Dame's website a while back that showed of over 3.7 million visits, only 1.07% of viewers actually clicked through the carousels. So if you have important information in your carousels, there's a good chance that many viewers are not actually going to see it. So content goes unread. Another thing is that carousels can slow your site down, which will impact your SEO. When a page initially loads, all of the content of the carousel loads, so especially if you have a lot of images in your carousel, this could slow down your pages quite a bit. And then of course there's mobile view. I rarely see a carousel work well in mobile view, even for a user without any disabilities. So if you're still not convinced, I'd recommend you to visit shouldiuseacarousel.com. It gives a really good visual to show you why it's not recommended. Or even just do a search for "Should I use a carousel?" and you'll see numerous articles from accessibility and SEO experts explaining why you should not use them. Moving on to page titles. Page titles is what you will see in the browser tab when you're viewing a website. So you can see the example I have here for our Biz Webmasters website. You can see home, which is which page I'm on, -Biz Webmasters, and it shows the website. That's something that will be declared in your CMS system. So whatever CMS system you're using, you want to be sure that it automatically does that for you. It's kind of one of those things that you can automate as you develop your website. Another element where you'll see you need to add a title is for something like an iframe. So you can see here if this was an iframe, and let's say this iframe considered a video, and the video was about website accessibility, my title could simply be Biz Webmasters Teaches About Website Accessibility. And then of course within that iframe tag I would have the video itself. Now, document accessibility. This is one I think that is overlooked a lot of times. Document accessibility pertains to the linked documents on your website. So if you link to PDF documents that contain information about your school or business or service that you offer, it needs to be accessible. And I say PDF documents because that's the most common format that we see, but it also pertains to other documents such as Word or Excel or PowerPoint documents that you link to your website. So basically the same accessibility standards you're applying to your web pages, you need to also apply to your documents. Now this could pertain to things like lunch menus, board agendas and minutes, financial reports, It could also be brochures, just anything that is a service or something that you're offering. You need to make sure that it is accessible in whatever format you have it in. One of the best techniques you can use is to use the tools provided in the software you use to create the document. So if you're using Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Adobe, all of these programs have great features that will help you make your documents accessible. And so you want to be sure to go ahead and use the features that they already have in place. Just as a note, if you're using Google Docs, I find the best option is to first convert it to a Word document and then convert it to a PDF from there. Now, this is an example of some of the things that are available in some of these programs. For example, things like defining list structures and headings. You'll want to use the list and heading options that are already available. You can always personalize the visual appearance of these elements, but using the tools they provide will create the structure needed to make the documents accessible. And of course, you want to be sure to check your color contrast, add alt text to images. Make sure your tables include a good heading structure. And if you use all of these tools in the source document, then when you convert it to a PDF, there'll be a tag structure created, and this will be what is used by Assistive Technologies to help them navigate the document, similar to how they would navigate a web page. So after you convert your documents to a PDF, you'll need to use something like Adobe to complete the process of making the documents accessible and to check the document's accessibility. The last item I want to mention are links to external websites. Again, just like your documents, if you link to a website that contains information about your school or a service or business, something that you're offering, it needs to be accessible. Now, if you're going to link to an external website that has information that is already on your website, then you should be covered because it's already on your website presented accessibly. So this would pertain to things like student and parent portals that we see on a lot of school websites, and teacher websites, again, that's school websites, registration platforms, anything you're linking to that your users have to visit in order to obtain information about your products or your services, you want to make sure that they're accessible. So contact your vendors and inquire about their accessibility. They should be able to provide you with some type of statement of accessibility showing where they are with it. If they can't provide something or they don't know what you're talking about, I'd encourage you to probably select another vendor who makes accessibility a priority, and then they can provide you with a statement, because although you can't control their website, you are responsible for yours and ensuring that you're providing accessible services to everyone. So I know I didn't cover every aspect of an accessible website, but I tried to cover some of the most common barriers we see to help you get started with checking your website and implementing accessibility throughout your web pages. Thanks for joining me, and I hope this information has been useful for you. If you have any questions or need help with your websites, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at any time.